Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to this fourth event from Bright Blue and our virtual event series looking ahead to COP26, presented in partnership with the John Ellerman Foundation. My name is Andrew Limming, and I'm a researcher in the Energy and Environment team at Bright Blue. This event today will focus on the topic of export finance and the risks and opportunities it presents for reaching net zero, both here in the UK and internationally. For those who may be unfamiliar with the term export finance, it refers to the provision of loans, insurance, guarantees, and other services to exporting businesses by their respective governments to offset the risks and challenges of developing projects abroad. Export finance is typically provided by export credit agencies, or ECAs, which often work closely with actors in private markets, such as banks and insurers. Our ECA here in the UK is UK Export Finance, or UKEF. Since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015, attention is focused on the role that export finance plays in driving greenhouse gas emissions and the destruction of nature. ECAs in the G20 alone, including UKEF, have accounted for around 26 billion annually in financing for fossil fuel projects since 2016, much of this going to create high carbon infrastructure in developing countries. However, despite its poor record on climate to date, UKEF has emerged in recent months as a leader on eliminating subsidies and insurance for fossil fuels, which it did in the end of March, adopting a key recommendation from the Environmental Audit Committee's 2019 report on UKEF. Still, there is much to do in aligning export finance with net zero, both here and abroad. So, in looking ahead to COP26, how can we ensure that ECAs contribute to reaching net zero? What role should exporting businesses play in supporting net zero strategies at ECAs? What further reforms to UKEF are needed now that fossil fuel financing and insurance has been eliminated? And how should ECAs approach the risk of stranded assets in fossil fuel markets? Here to discuss these questions with us today is an excellent panel of guests, including Phillip Dunne, MP, Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, Jenny Stanning, the External Relations Director at Oil and Gas UK, and Sam Hall, Director of the Conservative Environment Network. Before we begin, I just want to remind the audience that if you'd like to submit questions for the Q&A session, you can do so using the Slido event link located below the video, or on Twitter using the hashtag #BrightBlue. The speakers will have 5 minutes to discuss their ideas regarding export finance and net zero, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. If you'd like, Phillip, to start us off, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. I normally think of a Bright Blue event as sitting around a table eating some delicious concoction that you're giving to us, and I'm having to make do with a rather mouldy old cup of parliamentary coffee this morning, which is not a very good substitute. So I very much hope that we'll get a subsequent invitation to one of your slap-up-dos, having endured the coffee. So enough of that. I think you've asked me to join today because the Environmental Audit Committee looked at the issue of UK export finance as part of our sort of series of work into green finance in the previous Parliament, one that we intend to continue under this Parliament. But we did a report which was published in, we had a couple of evidence sessions, and we published a report in the summer of 2019, I think in June, in which we had looked at the energy investments which had been supported by UK export finance over the previous 5 years, and it amounted to something of the order of £2.6 billion supporting exports of energy projects in countries that qualified for export finance. And of that, 96%, so 2.5 billion of the 2.6, went to fossil fuel projects, mostly oil and gas rather than coal, but fossil fuel projects nonetheless. And we pointed to the irony, to put it mildly, that the government had signed up to commitments in Paris for net zero Britain. It had legislated, or in fact it legislated the following month, I think in July 2019, to achieve net zero Britain. And yet one of its primary agencies in affecting change internationally by supporting UK-based companies in their export efforts were completely ignoring this determination, and that policy objective needed to change. We described it at the time as an elephant in the room. Of course, the immediate government response to that was somewhat predictable, published in October 19, which did indicate that the net zero commitment had been made that summer. I think they said may have implications for UKEF, but they were really sort of saying that this was not something that could be changed quickly. It was the nationally determined commitments under the Paris agreements were not the UK's; these were the host country's responsibility, which was a rather bizarre response. That the support for for fossil fuel projects didn't restrict their ability to support renewable projects. There just weren't any, and I think they had a point there in that much of the investment that was going on in renewable energy was funded by inward investment into the North Sea, and much of the technology and the infrastructure around that investment was either being made by non-UK based companies, or it was not with UK based exportable technology. There was lots of advice, lots of finance that could be provided, but most of the corporate energy investors from the UK were primarily oil and gas, so perhaps wasn't that surprising. The other argument they made was that of just transition. They couldn't suddenly switch off supporting the oil and gas industry because of the economic damage that might do. We had recommended that the Swedish model of their export finance activity was the right model to follow, in which they reduced the support for oil and gas, and we thought that was something they would have to do. And with a bit of following wind and the support of the new government and the hosting of COP26 acting as a driving agent, the good news, as everyone on this call will be aware, is that in December at the Climate Ambition Summit, the Prime Minister announced that he would end UK export finance, aid funding and trade promotion for new crude oil, natural gas or thermal coal projects, with very few exceptions. So this heralded a big shift in the focus of UK export finance, and that's due to come into place during the course of this year. At the end of March, the government announced that implementation of this change in policy will back up the Prime Minister's statement made back in December, and when the 10-point plan for the Green Industrial Revolution was announced, and the adoption of the climate change financial disclosure standards provided the impetus for a change in policy direction for UKEF and a focus on renewable exports. So UK Export Finance published its first statement in March. In June, it has now signed an MOU with the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult as the first practical sign of the organisation seeking to get behind renewable energy exports and to start to build relations with the companies based in the UK which are doing this work, and that's a very positive sign. And I think we will see in the publications that they come out with of their new policies and objectives that UK Export Finance is going to transition into a renewable energy supporting entity, which will bring it in line with the government's net zero objectives after all. And we at the EAC can notch it down on our score sheet of notable successes. End of policy advertisement for the Environmental Audit Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. As a quick follow-up, I'd just like to ask, how do you think UKEF is doing in terms of addressing the emissions and climate impacts of its loan books and guarantees more broadly beyond the support it has provided for fossil fuel companies?
Well, we've seen little evidence of much follow-up in terms of trying to assess emissions from UKEF when we looked at it. It may be that that's changed and I'm out of date. It may be you or Sam are able to tell me what good work they're doing in that area. But it seems to me that it was just not in their policy criteria. Their objective was to fund projects rather than to assess their environmental credentials. So I think they were, they may have made some sort of token efforts to do so, but there wasn't much evidence to us that they were really monitoring properly.
I see. Thank you for that. Ginny, if you'd like to go ahead, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I absolutely echo Philip Dunne's comments about being invited back with a slap-up lunch. That sounds much better than my spare bedroom. Thanks for having me. I'd just like to set a bit of context for the oil and gas industry, if that's okay. So the UK offshore oil and gas industry is changing. It remains a crucial part of the UK economy, and we're committed as an industry to playing a positive role in the UK's energy future. Our industry has essential expertise, and it will urgently help the UK government meet its climate ambitions of being net zero by 2050. At the same time, this industry has an important economic role to play. It supports jobs, and it can create exciting energy careers of the future. Many oil and gas companies already produce energy from renewable sources, and we're on track to reduce our own emissions by 50% in 2030 and 90% by 2040. We are committed to helping make net zero by 2050 happen on time. We think that through a managed transition, we can create a greener and a cleaner future by ensuring that sustainable energy is affordable, by supporting jobs and developing new careers and opportunities, and by meeting oil and gas needs with cleaner resources that are produced with fewer emissions, like hydrogen. We also think we can develop homegrown greener energy and reduce our reliance on imported oil and gas. This means we're more accountable for our associated emissions rather than leaving it to other countries where emission standards may be lower. In terms of exports, let's not forget the oil and gas industry is one of the UK's most successful export sectors. Our latest export statistics show it to be worth around £11.5 billion to the UK economy. We surveyed some of our members in 2020, and we estimate that around 42% of those companies generate more than half of their revenue from non-UK business operations, and that only 10% have no non-UK revenue generation. That same data also showed that 90% of companies were aiming to increase their international sales throughout 2020 and 2021. We should also remember that other countries are still seeking to explore and produce their natural oil and gas resources. Rystad estimated that global expenditure through all areas of the supply chain from oil and gas producers between 2021 and 2025 could be up to $5 trillion. We don't think this overseas activity will stop as a result of UK policy change, and indeed other countries continue to actively support their supply chains to service this activity, recognising the benefits it brings to their supply chain and the economies that they're contributing to. We give you an example of Guyana. At present, GDP per person is around $7,000, and the IMF estimate this will increase to around $18,000 per head by 2025 as they realise their significant oil and gas resources. A number of West African nations are using European operators in their supply chains, backed by their government support to develop West African oil and gas assets. The only limit on this support is a contractually mandated minimum percentage of UK content. Now, UK companies are well placed to support this type of activity efficiently and safely by using new technology, which also delivers reduced emissions. There is no guarantee that non-UK suppliers that support this type of activities overseas will emphasise safe emissions reduction and the broader energy transition as their UK counterparts are focused on doing. Over the last year, UK overseas investors in this sector have increasingly announced their intention to become net zero companies, and they've started to outline how they're going to do that. These companies are transitioning to net zero, and while their investment in oil and gas will diminish, this investment will continue at lower levels until they no longer require the revenues to fund their new low carbon activities. If all UK government support for these oil and gas investments is taken away, it risks harming the UK's relationships with several governments that rely heavily on their oil and gas interests, and will make it much more difficult for these companies to invest in new low-carbon activities in these countries. Where UK investors withdraw, this is unlikely to lead to the foreign government stopping oil and gas production, but instead likely to lead to the entry of other companies that may not have similar environmental standards or the ambition of becoming net zero companies by 2050. If we use the North Sea as an example, we have an opportunity here to demonstrate to the world how a fair transition can be managed, namely protecting essential skills and capabilities in a mature oil and gas basin, underpinning the future industries of carbon capture and storage and hydrogen at home, providing clean energy and supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs in communities right across the UK. Not only can these capabilities then be exported, but the UK government can also then demonstrate climate leadership by showing other basins how to decarbonise their supply and manage their own fair transitions. So thanks for your time today, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A that follows.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Sam, if you'd like to take the floor, it's yours for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation, Bright Blue, to speak today. And it's great to be back at Bright Blue, where I spent over 2 years as a researcher and ultimately head of research working on energy and environment policy. And it's great to see you guys continuing to produce lots of high quality research, including on export credit agencies and how to align them with our climate commitments. So it's great to contribute to this discussion today. I wanted to start by just making an optimistic point about the progress we've seen on Paris alignment of export credit agencies over the last year. So France went first in October. The UK, as we've heard, came out with a world-leading policy in December to end all export credit for fossil fuel projects overseas. And well done to Phillip and his colleagues for championing this brilliantly on the Environmental Audit Committee and leading the charge in Parliament. In April, we had a coalition of 7 EU and European countries, I should say, including the UK and France, committing to aligning their export finance with the Paris Agreement. Joe Biden, as US President, has issued an executive order to end overseas fossil fuel financing in the US. And then we got an explicit commitment at the G7 for all the members of the G7 to end direct government financing for overseas coal projects, and a more general commitment around aligning finance with the Paris Agreement. So we've seen lots of progress in the last year, which I think if we'd had this event a year ago, we'd all be very surprised by it. Campaigners will argue that this is all long overdue and more far-reaching and quicker phase-outs of some of this financing are still required. There was that commitment in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement to align finance flows with the temperature goals in that agreement. But you know, as Jenny set out, we do have lots of embedded and incumbent industries and people that work in the coal, oil and gas sectors, and as well as phasing out support for fossil fuel projects, which I think is necessary on climate grounds, we do also need to support the industry with the transition to clean energy. And so it's understandable that governments take their time and need to get this right. It's also worth putting this in context that export credit agencies are not the only source of finance for fossil fuels. And indeed, even if we withdraw all ECA funding for fossil fuels, there are lots of other ways that fossil fuel projects can get financed. So multilateral development banks like the World Bank still finance overseas fossil fuel projects. Although, again, most of their investment portfolio is now going into clean energy. Private finance institutions are another source, including those based in London. And we had a recent report showing that the emissions of projects financed by financial institutions in the UK are equivalent to 1.8 times the UK's own territorial emissions. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, is another, and that continues to support developing countries to build fossil fuel infrastructure for a range of economic and geopolitical reasons. So the challenge doesn't just stop with export credit agencies. We need to tackle these other sources of finance and make sure they're also aligned with the Paris Agreement. I think we need to be optimistic about this story as well, because it's not just about ending or phasing out support for fossil fuels. It's about reforming ECAs so that they can deliver better for low carbon businesses and green energy solutions. You know, the IEA did a report recently looking at the pathway to net zero by 2050. They found that by 2030 we need clean energy investment to scale up threefold. So we're going to need lots more finance to get all those wind farms, solar panels built and constructed. And it's right that publicly backed export credit agencies are leading the way on this. And the reason we're doing this is not just for the climate, but increasingly this is the economic trend. The energy market is moving ineluctably towards renewable energy, and in most markets now, according to IRENA, solar and wind power are cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuel alternative in terms of new power infrastructure. And it's only right that when ECAs are investing taxpayers' money in projects, they assess carefully the risk that taxpayers' funds might be spent on assets that become stranded. And similarly, when we're looking to support developing countries with their development pathways, we need to make sure we don't lock them into infrastructure that's going to become uneconomic and uncompetitive in the years ahead. We want to be helping developing countries leapfrog, if possible, fossil fuels to go straight to clean energy, which we know is going to be cheaper. And the final point I want to make is that with the encouraging of green exports from the UK, it's not just about export finance. There's a range of policy tools that the government needs to look at, and I think the role of ECAs is important, but it's not the only factor. So we need more governments, for example, to adopt some of our policy mechanisms like contracts for difference or renewable schemes that have been so effective in attracting investment and bringing down the cost of capital. If we want to get some of our renewables businesses accessing those markets, having those policy frameworks that we've worked so well in the UK will be a real help for them. We need to have a big push on reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade in low carbon goods and services as well, so that our exporters have good market access. So there's a range of complementary trade policies that I think we need to help get our green exports fired up. I'll leave it there, but yeah, thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sam, very much for those comments. Following on some of the points that you made, and some of the points that everyone made, but specifically referring to the Environmental Audit Committee's 2019 report on UTEP. Phillip, there was a lot of emphasis in the recommendations and conclusions from that report that UTEP should adopt and align with the net zero target. Is perhaps an effective way of ensuring that UTEP moves in that direction to make financing and insurance from UTEP conditional upon companies having their own net zero strategies in place and complying with the TCFD recommendations?
Well, I think it's a nice idea. I think that the main focus needs to be on the project itself. So the focus needs to be shifting from fossil fuel funded projects to non-fossil fuel funded projects. That would have much the biggest impact. Then I think the imposing a sort of second tier of conditionality on the applicant is probably a second order of issue and can perhaps follow. I mean, it is the case. We looked at a particular project in Iraq, which was funded through a contractor based in Turkey, and it was a construction project of a new oil facility in Iraq, which had claims that the UK would receive. I think 60% was going to be a majority of the contract work would be going to UK companies as subcontractors to the Turkish entity, but the prime contractor was a Turkish-based business over which the UK would have very little influence. So I think and I'm not an expert on the generality of UK ES client base. One would expect it would be British-based rather than British subcontracting entities. So I'm a bit cautious about imposing too strong an environmental requirement on the contracting entity to start with. I think the most important thing is that the underlying projects help the countries in which they're being developed to create their own sustainable renewable energy infrastructure.
Jenny, would you perhaps like to weigh in on that question? We know that companies in the North Sea and the oil and gas sector generally foresees over the coming decade and beyond a shift toward net zero. Do you think that it's important for the sector and for those being supported by UKIF, right, to have those externally verified net zero strategies in place, to have TCFDs in place? Do you think that detailed description of the processes that will take place should be a condition for receiving public finance in this way?
So I would agree with first, I would agree with what Philip said about let's focus on the project and make sure, like before the supplementary you just asked, Andrew, I just wanted to come in and say I agree with what Philip said about making sure that the projects that UKEF and other export credit agencies are funding support the country on its decarbonisation. And for some countries, those projects will all be renewable projects, absolutely brilliant, that will help them get to net zero quickly. But for other countries, then there will be interim projects that help countries move from open fires, from coal, and sometimes natural gas can be a great bridger to that. But I do think that needs to be assessed on a project by project base, and I think it's important to get that understanding of transition there. That it's not as simple as saying oil and gas bad, renewable energy good. There are shades of transition, and we need to support countries to do that in the best way for them. And it might not be the way that we have chosen to do it in the UK, but I do think it's important to remember that the bulk of our greenhouse gas emission reduction comes from a switch in the UK from coal to natural gas, bridging towards clean renewable energy and looking at new energies like hydrogen. So I just think it's important to get that as a bit of context there. But you asked about net zero policies for our companies. You're absolutely right, Andrew. Loads of our big companies particularly are publishing well thought through strategies that show how they can transform from being purely oil and gas into integrated energy companies. And if you look around the UK at the net zero clusters, for example, there tends to be an oil and gas operator that is now turning into an integrated energy operator, driving these clean clusters forward. And there's no coincidence. These are companies that understand energy, they understand the markets, they understand supply chains, and in some circumstances they have a fantastic experience of operating in very hostile environments. So it's no coincidence that there are oil and gas operators transforming into net zero companies going forward. In terms of TCFD recommendations, I believe they already apply to a certain tier of companies already. So many of our bigger members, and OGUK, just for those of you who don't know us and aren't familiar with us, we represent all kinds of companies throughout the offshore oil and gas industry, from the tier 1 contractors and operators that will be caught by TCFD recommendations and reporting already, right down to the SMEs community as well. And on the SME community, I again very much agree with Phillip Dunne in terms of making sure that we don't add additional bureaucracy that could prevent supporting energy transition projects overseas and in the UK. Some of the companies that we have in our membership are doing some really exciting things in the energy transition world, both domestically here in terms of moving towards hydrogen and supporting the development of carbon capture and storage, and taking that expertise that they've honed through decades of work in the North Sea in oil and gas and applying it to new energy. So they epitomise the energy transition here. And we want to support them to take that capability and expertise overseas and help other countries either decarbonise their existing oil and gas assets, operate them more efficiently, reduce emissions on their existing oil and gas infrastructure, or just apply it straight to green hydrogen projects, carbon capture projects. Therefore, minimising bureaucracy, particularly for the SME community, I think is really important.
Excellent. Related to these points that have been raised, we have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to kind of package them together. So from an anonymous participant, there's a question, and I'll put this to Sam if that's okay. A point made by campaigners following the implementation of the phase-out fossil fuel financing and insurance at UKEF was that UKEF will still be supporting natural gas, for instance. So one of our viewers asked, should UKEF still support transitional energy projects, i.e. natural gas, to help countries transition from dirtier forms of energy, such as coal, toward clean energy, and on what time scale?
Thanks, Andrew. So I think generally, I think there is a limited scope for new fossil infrastructure that is not retrofit, that doesn't have carbon capture storage attached to it. I think that's the message that the International Energy Agency sent quite clearly in the recent pathway to net zero by 2050 that they did, looking at how globally we can deliver the 1.5 degree temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. So I think there are a few very small and limited exemptions in the UK policy for certain types of gas infrastructure. I think they're quite small personally, and I'm not something that I'm personally worried about. But I do think more generally, we do have to recognise that the global carbon budget is not that big if we actually want to keep 1.5 degrees within track, within size. And the IEA's evidence is that as well as bringing to an end new unabated fossil fuel infrastructure, we do need to, within a number of years, look at phasing out existing, particularly coal plants, existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So yeah, I think the UK example, the UK policy, I think, is generally well leading. The exemptions are pretty tightly drawn, not a massive concern. I think where the challenge is in the UK policy, where I would like to see them go further, is looking at some of the financing institutions of which the UK is either a significant shareholder or owner, or sits on the board, has a kind of large voting interest, which have still not got a sort of equivalently strong policy to UK export finance. I think getting the UK to use its voting rights and some of these other institutions to try and push wider adoption of similar policies is a bigger priority than the sort of closing those sort of last few gas loopholes.
Yeah, so this kind of builds on a couple of points raised by the audience again. So an anonymous viewer, though, sort of pushing back a little bit on the point about carbon capture and storage, asks, where are we seeing carbon capture and storage? And I would add hydrogen in this mix, working at scale within low or middle income countries currently. If these transitional assets are being developed and we can mitigate emissions with the technologies we have available, do we have any examples at hand of that actually working in practice to achieve the outcomes we want? Maybe I would put that to you, Jenny, if you like, and then we can open it up for further comments.
Sure, thanks, Andrew. So carbon capture is potentially quite exciting for not just the oil and gas industry in terms of the opportunities it offers us, but also for the other sectors that will depend on carbon capture being deployed at scale if we're to meet our net zero commitments. I do think, again, I'm being really naughty here and alluding back to your previous question about the financial institutions, everybody has a responsibility to deliver net zero. So not just UTEP, not just the oil and gas industry, and not just some of these financial institutions that you brought up, but everybody has a responsibility to work together, including the harder to decarbonize sectors that will depend on carbon capture being deployed at scale. So for me, it's carbon capture and storage isn't just about supporting other nations to use natural gas that's then abated by carbon capture at scale, but it's also a domestic opportunity and a necessity for us to develop carbon capture at a commercial scale to allow some of our harder to decarbonize sectors to continue, which is really important for our economy. Your point specifically about, are there any examples? I think there's a couple in Australia attached to oil and gas interests, but we also have some clusters, quite exciting clusters around the UK. And this is my point about using our domestic capability and supporting our domestic supply chain, which has built up a world-leading reputation for supporting the oil and gas industry, to get in there and make carbon capture commercially viable and operate at scale at the UK. If we can do it in the UK, we can then export that capabilities overseas, and we can support other nations who are perhaps further behind us on the decarbonisation journey to deploy the same technologies and almost leapfrog, learn from, I don't want to say learn from our mistakes because no one wants to make a mistake, but learn from the developments that we pioneered here in the UK and export that capability overseas and help other people do the same.
Is this phase?
Could I chip in, Andrew?
Of course, yes.
I mean, I'm not aware of. I mean, very interesting what Jenny had to say about that and answer that excellent question. I'm not personally aware of any specific projects where this is happening, but there is no doubt that in those countries which have reserves of oil and gas, I mean, Mozambique leaps to mind, where previously they might have been reliant on imported fossil fuels, then I think there is an argument to be made over transition that it would be better to exploit readily exploitable fossil fuel assets rather than require them to be imported, because of the impact that that will have on the economy and the economic environmental cost of moving fuel around the world could be mitigated. So I think that's the argument in favour of it for a period of time. But clearly there are a number of countries, like in the Gulf, in particular the UAE, who are developing very significant proposals to decarbonise their economies, having been entirely reliant on fossil fuel. And I think some of the examples of what they'll be doing, they will then also be seeking to export. So I think we'll see quite a lot of competition in this area to help developing countries, not least from the major geopolitical forces that are trying to use trade as a means of building their own influence in the world. So China in particular, but other countries as well. So I think there will be a twin track approach used. I'm sure that oil and gas will continue to be exploited in countries in parallel to renewable energy, and I think that's not something that we as the UK should seek to prevent. But I think we should be trying to encourage our companies to bid into renewable energy projects, and we should be prepared to support them and hope that these have both economic and environmental benefit, which is recognised by the host country that we're trying to help.
Thank you for that. Actually, it connects closely with an audience question. Sue Wilshire from Tier Fund asks, how can ECAs help to scale up renewable off-grid or mini-grid electricity in lower-income countries? I think in the background of this, there's an important question about the UK's capacity to deliver and export some of these technologies. So I would ask Philip, what do you see in terms of the role of UTEP to assist, say, SMEs, other companies, supply chains within the UK to develop the capacity we need domestically, but also the type that we can export to other countries?
Well, I think this is a really quite exciting opportunity, because UTEP does help support SMEs, not just the majors. Obviously, in this sector, in energy, historically, they've been supporting major contractors because they're the companies that have been in a position to win tenders internationally. But if you look at the renewable sector, where there's a huge amount of innovation happening amongst British companies, in particular amongst SMEs, a lot of these are developing propositions which are specifically tailor-made for developing countries which doesn't have an established electrical grid, for example. So I visited a company the other day just adjacent to my constituency, which is producing battery storage capacity to run energy systems up to not exactly town scale, but village scale, which will run off generated from solar power, but their particular expertise is in developing the software that can convert that into battery to release the energy into a host of applications in a controllable way. And I think we will see those sorts of companies that may have project sizes which are typically below the radar. They need to be available for UKEF to support them, and I think they will be. So I think the opportunity won't happen. There won't be the turnaround in such in scale at speed, because many of the traditional oil and gas installations that UKEF have been supporting that we looked at were all £100 million projects, and you're unlikely to get that scale of project coming out of the SMEs that are where the company has the capacity to fulfill orders at scale. They tend to be smaller projects, and that's a little bit more bureaucratic and cumbersome to manage. But I think UKEF absolutely needs to start developing those skills and those relationships.
Andrew, can I come in on the back of that? Thank you. I just wanted to agree wholeheartedly with that. When we went out to talk to our SME community about UKEF, that was one of the points they raised. They felt that it was, although what it was doing was brilliant, it wasn't set up for companies that were smaller. And I absolutely agree with what Phillip Dunne has just said about making sure that UKEF funding is accessible to all companies that are out there doing exciting things, particularly in renewables. And the company in your constituency sounds fantastic and exactly the kind of company that we need to support to go out and help other countries decarbonise. And I think driving public agencies who are there to support the energy transition domestically and overseas to be more accessible to smaller companies, and like you said, to build relationships on the ground, and to use associations like us, Renewable UK, Scottish Renewables, Hydrogen Fuel Battery Cells Association. There are loads of associations set up that are member owned that can help highlight funding opportunities like UKEF. And I think it's really important that we work to reduce the bureaucratic burdens that some of this UK government support brings with it.
Yeah. Excellent. I have a question for you from the audience here. So in this transition that we're discussing, and obviously on the timeline that we need to make these massive shifts, right? We have a lot of capacity to develop, and there are going to be industries that are changing. So a viewer asks, how can we protect jobs, and I would say create jobs as well through the energy transition, and while helping other countries decarbonize? What would be the best set of policies that could promote that protection and creation of green jobs?
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I think, yeah, you probably need a kind of two-pronged approach. You need to, there's a set of incumbent industries, if you like, which are fossil fuel dependent, and they're going to have to undergo a transition as a result of net zero to move away from the use of fossil fuels. Some of those industries, most of those industries, I think, actually can transition. There will be a future for them in a net zero world. Others, like oil and gas, we do expect the volumes of oil and gas production to fall as a result of net zero for obvious reasons. So there, the disruption and potential job losses are likely to be bigger. So I think, the kind of two-pronged approach for government there is, supporting the businesses to transition, take up new, switch to clean technologies, and then where some industries just aren't able to exist in a net zero world for climate reasons, we support those businesses and workers to find alternative employment, reskilling schemes, etc. I guess the other strand of it, though, is making sure that there are going to be these disruptive new technologies, new businesses that didn't exist before, or where we need to have the right set of market signals and regulatory frameworks in place to enable those companies to grow and set up here in the UK. And I think the policies that the government set out in the 10-point plan around CCS, hydrogen, floating offshore wind, potentially huge global industries where the UK has some key strengths and ability, I think, to really dominate some of those global markets. We need to keep supporting those, and I think trade is going to be key to that. Yes, there will be a large domestic market as a result of our own net zero policies and climate ambition here in the UK, but we also want to sell this technology around the world, and that will support jobs in the UK, as well as helping to spread some of the brilliant innovations of UK scientists and engineers around the world, helping other countries to decarbonise more cost effectively. So I think net we will see an increase in employment as a result of this transition. That seems to be what generally the economic modelling suggests. So I'm optimistic on the jobs front. But yeah, I think we need a plan both for the kind of incumbent industries and to really capture the new industries as well, in order to make sure that those jobs are opportunities are maximised.
Andrew, can I come in on the back of that one as well? You can
Absolutely.
tell me down if you.
Yes, no, happy to have you jump in.
Great. Okay, so I agree, again, completely agree with what Sam's just said about a focus on incumbent industries too. And I just think it's worthwhile if you're looking for policies where government can support, in addition to the 10-point plan, which we welcomed, that was published, goodness me, back end of last year. Losing track of the years. The North Sea Transition Deal that was signed in March as well. This is a groundbreaking agreement between our sector, the UK offshore oil and gas sector, and the UK government. It's the first of its kind by a G7 country, and we think it can be a global exemplar of the UK showing climate leadership in the run-up to COP26 as well. So it's a partnership that aims to accelerate the energy transition, but also to reduce UK emissions and create and sustain jobs across the country. So that point that the questioner made, and also the point that Sam has picked up about people and jobs and communities being wrapped up in the energy transition as well. These aren't faceless numbers anymore. This is, you know, Laura, the pipeline engineer that's offshore at the moment. It's Matthew, the project engineer. It's Craig, the cutting engineer. These are all people, and they're part of the transition as well, and they can be part of the transition in industries like ours. And that's where the North Sea Transition Deal is quite exciting. In terms of, it breaks down, it's got 5 specific areas where government and industry can work together to drive the energy transition, but also protect jobs now and sustain them for the future as well. So it looks at supply decarbonisation, it looks at carbon capture and hydrogen, it looks at how we transform the supply chain, and it also looks at those people I was just talking about and skills as well. And I think, asking specifically about the policy, the bit that's most exciting is the idea of it's a partnership between industry and government. It's the two working together to achieve net zero. And hopefully that could be held up as a kind of global exemplar, particularly at an international climate change conference like COP26, as this is how you can do it. This is how you can take a fossil fuel economy and make a just and fair transition towards net zero at pace, working with the industry and not leaving people and communities behind.
Thank you for that, Jenny. The North Sea Transition Deal was certainly very important. It will be interesting to see exactly how it's implemented and the key checkpoints along the way monitored for compliance in terms of the emissions reductions and job creation that it's spelled out. But on your last point, I'd like to go round and conclude with a question that kind of builds on the series that we're doing, which is looking ahead to COP26. And I'll start with Philip, and it's building on a question from Daniel Dipper in the audience. At COP26, what position should the UK take on an agreement to green export finance, and what would this look like?
Well, I think that's a great question, and it's a great opportunity, this Glasgow conference, for the UK to show some leadership. We've got, you know, Mark Carney as the UN ambassador on green finance, who is well placed to be able to try and drive some identity of interest here amongst the major countries that have export credit agencies, and to the UK has already now, I would say belatedly, but it has, you know, recently committed to do this. So I think that showing that leadership and putting it into the framework of the package of green finance measures that the host nations are trying to deliver, this is a relatively straightforward one, I would have thought, to try and push through. Obviously, nothing is straightforward when it comes to international agreements, but there are some countries, I mentioned Sweden, that are showing the way, and if with the new US administration willing to get behind such a proposition, I think it would have a really good chance of making some headway. In terms of what it would look like, you know, I think it would need to start with the G7, the G20 countries, and if you could get that group of countries agreeing a common position to phase out fossil fuel export finance over a period of time, I would have thought that's an eminently achievable mission.
Excellent. Jenny, would you like to share your thoughts on export finance at COP, what we're needing in that regard?
So I think for us, a successful COP in this regard will see the UK government using its presidency to leverage global leadership, but also to share best practice. So we want to see announcements that help other countries in their transition, in their own energy transition, but making them sustainable as well. I think we would be supportive of the UK starting to legislate around green finance and our green taxonomy. We know there's lots of ambition out there. We've heard lots of announcements, lots of warm words. So we'd like to see some action. And we'd like to see that action shared by not just one industry, but by everybody. We want to see everybody taking responsibility and action. And that doesn't mean divestment from fossil fuels funding overnight. This doesn't seem particularly ethical, and it will have a big impact on the workforce of sectors like ours, on pension funds, but also on our sector's ability to support the energy transition at home and overseas. So global leadership and sharing best practice for sustainable energy transitions across the world. Easy.
Sam, would you like to share your thoughts and wrap us up?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, to echo what Phillip said, I think we had that G7 commitment in the communique early this year around ending overseas coal financing. That feels to me an achievable goal that we should try and get everyone at COP signed up to. I think oil and gas will be more difficult if we're being realistic, getting ends for phasing those out. I think we should try, and there may well be a kind of coalition of countries that we can build that have got that kind of full set of fossil fuel phase out dates set out. But I think getting a sort of agreement around coal in the first instance, I think should be a big priority, because we can't, at the G7, if the G7 stops funding overseas coal and China just fills the gap, and there's no net impact on the climate there, we have to try and internationalize those commitments, get broader uptake. But again, to go back to a sort of more optimistic point, I think it's one of the big, well, if not the biggest theme of this COP26 will be the need for developed countries to provide finance for developing countries to achieve their climate goals and to upgrade their energy infrastructure to clean energy. And here, I think, although often the focus is on aid and ODA funding, I think we should also see the finance that export credit agencies can provide as being part of the solution as well, particularly those of us who want to see a more market-based approach to tackling climate change. I think there are huge opportunities if we can massively increase the volume of finance through export credit agencies that is going to support clean energy infrastructure in developing countries. Then we are, as developed countries, helping to deliver on that. And things like the Clean Green Initiative that the Prime Minister was championing at the Green 7, or the Build Back Better World thing, I think it ended up being called in the G7 communique, I think should be seen as part of this debate. We know that there's a vast amount of clean energy infrastructure investment required. I think I said it was a threefold increase by 2030, according to the IEA. So there's a vast job ahead of us, but there's also huge commercial opportunities for companies looking to make those investments. We know that the energy is now cost competitive, and we know it can help developing countries get more prosperous and create jobs and get access to affordable energy. So I think, yeah, let's have a really big offer around that as well at this COP, and make sure that ECAs are kind of central to that debate on climate finance.
Excellent. Great points from all. Looking ahead to COP, we'll see which positions win out over the longer term. Hopefully everyone wins. I would like to thank our panelists, Phillip, Jenny, Sam, for sharing their thoughts on the topic today. And I'd like to thank the audience as well for some great questions and your participation. Bright Blue will be doing more of the Looking Ahead to COP series. Coming up next month, we have an event on greening ODA with Harriet Baldwin, MP, and an event on sustainable aviation. Back to back, so lots to tune into in July. But on behalf of Bright Blue, which you can follow on Twitter, we are Bright Blue. My name's Andrew. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Bright Blue.